Hello, I'm Terence Samuel. I am the Saka Fellow in International Journalism here at the Berkley Center. And today we are going to talk a little bit about international journalism and what that feels like these days. We live in a very fraught moment where the idea of domestic versus international foreign news seems to be completely dead. Given what we see in Ukraine and Iran and the Middle East, it feels like all of those issues are affecting our own politics and our own policy in very direct ways. At the same time, I think the ecosystem that kind of supported the best international journalism seems to be collapsing. And I don't know that there was a time when we needed it more. We have with us today two amazing journalists, both former foreign correspondents who I am proud to call friends. Didrik Schanche, the chief international editor at NPR, and Alan Sipress, until very recently the senior editor for international news, Middle East editor, and prior to that, editor for the Global South. Thank you both for being here, and welcome.
At the Washington Post.
At the Washington Post.
Everybody needs an editor.
Especially me. How did I miss that? In any case, I want to take advantage of kind of their own personal experience and expertise, because they've been doing it a long time. They've seen everything happen and what continues to happen. And I think it is a chance for us to talk a little bit about what's changed, what's working, what's not working, and the challenges ahead. And so that's where we will begin. Didi, why don't I start with you? You still have a large group of correspondents around the world. Are we 17 bureaus? Is that
14.
14
yeah.
bureaus around the world. You still, by necessity, must pay a lot of attention to conflict. But talk a little bit about what your correspondents have to deal with that is different from when you were in Cairo or Nairobi or Cyprus.
Well,
Spelled the wrong way.
Thanks. I'll just start first with the bureaus. NPR remains deeply committed to international news, which is a very expensive thing to be committed to as a news organization. It's just expensive to maintain bureaus around the globe. In our case, our bureaus amount to usually a single person covering a vast region, often an entire continent, from their home office. So to call them bureaus is a little bit fancy for what we've actually got. But what I do have are a team of incredibly committed journalists who are committed to fact-based reporting, sound-rich, character-rich reporting, in a world that is, as we all know, information flows in very different ways than it did when I first started in this business. And it can often be a torrent, and it can often be difficult to tease out fact from fiction. Our bureaus, our recent bureau, whatever bureau changes we've had recently have been driven by conflicts and our need to cover them. We opened our Ukraine bureau in Kyiv in 2022. A couple of months after that war started, we had been committing a lot of NPR's reporting resources to that conflict because we didn't have anybody there before. And it was such a big, dramatic, and unanticipated event. I was rotating, teams of 4 correspondents at a time through, and they would stay for weeks at a time, which meant that I had to draw staff from elsewhere in the organization, which conversely provided opportunities for a lot of staff at NPR who had always wanted to do international reporting but never had an opportunity to get that experience and deal with some of the complexities that come with being a foreign correspondent. It is more challenging than being a reporter here in the US in many ways, not least of which just getting people on the phone to talk to them and get responses, to pin down facts. And in today's world, the security aspect is something that we have to pay attention to with pretty much every story at this point, because risks have changed and security needs have changed. And NPR, as the Washington Post and most other news organizations, now have either permanent security advisors on staff or have hired contractors to help advise us on security concerns or issues. And they help us think through what we're doing, what risks we're going to face or the teams will face, and what they need, PPE, helmets, vests, security goggles, trauma kits, et cetera. But the bureaus that we've been setting up recently have been driven a lot by conflict. So we had the Kyiv in 2022. We're just now reestablishing an Istanbul bureau, which we had up to about 2 years ago, and it got shut for financial reasons. But we now need again because Istanbul, Turkey is a great place from which to monitor developments in Iran. And I think Iran is going to be, if not a conflict, certainly a story that we're going to need to be paying a lot of attention to for a long time to come, because not just its regional influence, but its global influence. We're seeing the impact through the Strait of Hormuz. And I think I've sort of veered off of the point of your question.
We will veer back. Alan, when we first started talking about this, the world was a very different place, it seems. Not just out there in the world. As you pointed out, Iran hadn't happened, and then you were at that point the Middle East editor at the Washington Post. Talk a little bit about how some of those changes have, how you saw those coming and how you're dealing with it.
Sure. As you mentioned, Terry, when we first discussed holding a panel discussion, we thought it would be valuable to focus on the challenge we in the media face, finding an audience for international news, especially at a time when so much attention is focused on domestic politics, immigration and enforcement activities, federal government upheaval, the East Wing, the ballroom, et cetera. Since then, as you suggest, there have been two developments that have dramatically recast this conversation. First, the United States, along with Israel, has gone to war in Iran, and the coverage of that conflict has dominated one news cycle after the next, with websites and front pages heavy with the latest twists and turns. At a moment like this, there has been no struggle to attract the attention of readers for international news, or listeners or viewers, though there's an ongoing conversation about how to make the most of that audience and how best to serve it with a variety of content, whether it be breaking news stories, explainers, features, analytical pieces, or video, audio, and graphics pieces. The other major development has been the decision of the Washington Post, which was once among the most storied news organizations in this country, to gut its newsroom. In early February, as you may have heard, the Post laid off nearly half of all its journalists, close to 400 people. The Foreign News Department, which had once been one of the premier foreign desks in this country, was essentially eviscerated. Most of the foreign reporters were laid off. Most of the editors were laid off. On the eve of the war with Iran, the entire Middle East team at the Washington Post was laid off. That included one of the most talented Iran reporters in America, a woman named Yeganeh Torbati, who has luckily found a home now at the New York Times, and the Jerusalem bureau chief, who just 2 years ago was a finalist for Pulitzer Prize. I was the Middle East editor, and I was laid off along with my deputy editor. But it wasn't just the Middle East. The entire China team was eliminated, the Ukraine team was eliminated, all the reporters but one covering Russia were laid off. And I should note that the national security team at the Washington Post, the folks who cover the Pentagon, the intelligence community, the State Department, those reporters and editors were spared, and they continue to do very, very strong and important work. But they do it essentially with one arm tied behind their back, because the foreign reporters they long partnered with on the most important stories are now gone. If the question before this panel was to be, how does the media find an audience for international news? One clear answer is you certainly don't do it by eliminating foreign news coverage at a top news organization. I should say there's still a few extremely talented journalists remaining at the Post to cover the world, including some that I've had the privilege to manage in the recent past. But they're stretched very thin. In many cases, they're working now in parts of the world that they have no experience in, and many of them don't have editors who have experience in those parts of the world either. So when we were first getting ready back in the winter for this panel, before it was delayed in part by a blizzard, I had prepared remarks exploring how the media could make its reporting more resonant for the audience at a time when there isn't an all-consuming story like the war in Iran. I was going to talk about how I'd been working in recent years to re-envision the Post's international report so that it would better connect with readers. I started making this a priority about 4 years ago when I took responsibility for running the Post's coverage of the Global South. We know from experience that news stories and feature stories, or what we call enterprise stories, from Africa and much of Asia often have trouble breaking through with readers, especially younger readers. Many readers are not familiar with the countries that we'd be writing about. Stories from these parts of the world often struggle to find an audience. So what I had started to do was introduce a different approach, especially as it applies to enterprise stories. I introduced a thematic approach and worked with my correspondents to identify specific themes across their geographic patches that we suspected could connect with readers, again, especially with younger readers. These themes, for instance, included stories about climate change, in particular about the forces that drive climate change below the radar, or about the unintended consequences of addressing climate change, for instance, the collateral damage from mining and processing minerals for electric vehicles. Another one of the themes we started covering aggressively was the relationship between autocratic leaders and big tech. We did a series of stories that was very successful, looking at how Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi uses technology to surveil, disinform, and manipulate the Indian population. Other themes that we identified and that we began to really drill into included Russia's efforts to project power across the Global South, in particular in the Sahelian region of Africa. We looked at China's increasing influence, and we also identified human rights as a theme we wanted to explore that we thought readers continue to want to read about. I'd be happy to discuss this new approach more if we wanted to in a discussion up here or in the Q&A, if you're interested. Candidly, even before the recent events at the Post, delivering international coverage and reaching an audience had been a challenge. Before I came to the international desk as an editor about 8 years ago, I had been on the Post's national desk, where I had worked with Terry, who had been a political editor there at the time. My role was essentially to be the national desk's chief operating officer, making sure that our national report was forward-leaning and timely, with one eye always on the competition. I watched our traffic metrics very closely. After I moved to international and I started looking at its traffic numbers, my heart sank. International stories, by and large, were getting only a small fraction of what national stories about Trump and domestic politics would bring up. That reality continues to confront the shrinking number of news organizations that ambitiously cover the world, notably National Public Radio. And it remains an urgent task for the media to do better in engaging readers for the health of our news organizations, for the sake of our country, and for those who live inside its borders and outside.
Didi, the thematic approach that Alan describes is obviously something that is very kind of entwined into the fabric of kind of what NPR does. You, however, have been forced to cover these conflicts, and so there's a lot of daily news. Does it feel different doing this, given kind of the change in the landscape of the competition?
I mean, yeah, I guess. I don't think that it's really necessarily in relation to the change of the landscape of the competition. It's more the changing landscape of how news is delivered. NPR is multi-platform. We are known best for our broadcast, which remains still incredibly, we've got a very strong core audience, but it's also been a very particular audience. It tends to be better educated, higher incomes, et cetera. Our challenge has been to gain traction online through written stories, and also to try to attract younger, more diverse audiences, both for the future of the organization and also just to get our incredible reporting out to bigger audiences. And we've been really successful in the latter through Instagram. I mean, we've got these Instagram news reels that are like a minute long that I think are the best translation of what we are famous for on broadcast on any other platform. They're really engaging. They're very low tech because we don't have camera crews. Most of our reporters don't even have producers. So they're like filming themselves and recording themselves and meanwhile swiveling around so that you can see the burning building or whatever behind them. But this is how we are trying to, this is one of the big changes for news media is just the number of platforms that you need to be on. And you need to be on them with the same level of quality and fact-based reporting as every other platform. The latest, I mean, for NPR at any rate, we might be kind of late to the game, but it's YouTube. You know, there are an awful lot of podcasts to news organizations who, even if audiences aren't watching them, they're listening to them through YouTube. So NPR is trying to do more of that, but, you know, in Instagram, it's a vertical thing, and in YouTube, it's a horizontal taping. So technology.
How do you cover the war in Iran on YouTube?
That's a good question. And you know, a lot of our YouTube is not the most, I shouldn't say this, but a lot of our YouTube isn't the most compelling because it's like one person talking to another person. We have cameras in the studios, so you can watch smart people say smart things about a challenging situation.
Kind of like now.
Iran, we have not gotten visas into Iran, so we have not had anybody on the ground in Iran. We keep applying, but we keep getting rejected. So we have been having to cover it afar from Istanbul, from the border of Turkey with Iran, or the border of Iraq with Iran. We have producers and interpreters who have contacts within the country, so we managed to do interviews with people on the ground to learn about life there. We do obviously also look at social media, but understand that, you know, social media needs to be confirmed. You can't necessarily trust the things that you're seeing on X or whatever the platform might be. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. So now the war, let's stay with that for a second. The war in Iran, which you're watching kind of as a civilian, do you feel the difference of not having, I mean, certainly at the Post, yes, but does the coverage of the war feel like it's carrying the same weight and credibility that you would have had you had your team in place?
I think there are news organizations that are certainly doing a very, very good job covering it. I think the New York Times has been doing an excellent job, both in terms of covering the war from the region and also from Washington. I think that the Wall Street Journal has been doing a very fine job, especially with its reporting out of Washington, but overseas as well. I'm hooked on National Public Radio and think they do a great job and can't get through a morning or an evening without listening to them. So I do think there are news organizations who are doing good work, and they're trying to do the things that Didi was talking about, trying to get visibility into what's happening inside Iran, as well as the countries you can get into. And some are having some luck. The Times in particular has a couple reporters now who speak Persian, who have a wide range of contacts inside, and have been able to report out not only what is happening on the street with the Iranian population, but even within the halls of power. So I've been pretty impressed. There's also been good work in the Atlantic that I consistently find illuminating. I have to say, however, and my wife would tell you this, every day I think of the 20 stories I wish I was assigning that I can't. And even though I don't have stories to assign, I'm still addicted to the story. So I read as deeply as I ever did.
So the world is literally on fire. I mean, my contribution to the opening of the conflict in Ukraine was to have to send out a pronouncer on Kiev versus Kyiv.
Yes.
It was it was traumatic for my newsroom, and for me. But, I mean, when you think about that run of stories, Ukraine, Venezuela, October 7th, Gaza, Iran, how is it that we can't convince people that international reporting is important?
I would argue that for NPR's audience, international reporting is important. In fact, surveys of our audience show that it's usually either the top or the second most important topic for them. I agree with Alan, it can be difficult to engage audiences on some of the more remote regions, more remote stories, the issues that afflict the global South in ways that, audiences seem to feel, they've heard before and what's new. But I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't continue doing this job if I didn't think I was getting through to somebody somewhere, or that our reporting wasn't getting through to somebody somewhere. And I think it really is. And covering international news is more important now than ever, which you noted at the start, because the world has become, because the world's going through a lot of changes, power struggles, or power shifts. The global power structure is shifting under this administration, under this U.S. under the influence of this administration's decisions. But not just that, it's also the conflict in Europe and the conflicts across the Middle East, and where this is the sorts of hands this is handing China, which before all of this broke out was considered the chief story for the U.S., the United States chief competitor. At any rate, it does become ever more important for Americans to understand what's happening elsewhere in the world and how it affects their dollar, how it affects their lives, and it does.
I would second what Didi said. I think there is an audience, and there always has been, and I suspect there always will be. There will be an audience always interested in international news. And then at moments of crisis, at moments of conflict, that audience balloons. It gets very, very large. We used to see that at the Post. And certainly what you've mentioned, from Gaza to Venezuela to Iran, you would see the spikes in the audience. But there were a number of different challenges. One is the spikes would not last. They would tend to fall off pretty quickly. And the other is that there was a concern that the coverage would almost be a commodity. You could be getting similar coverage of the facts of the story from any of a half dozen first-rate news organizations. So the question is, how do you maintain that high level of interest? And how do you do journalism that distinguishes itself, that gives people a reason to come read what you're writing and what you're publishing, instead of going somewhere else or in addition to going somewhere else? And I do think that's gotten harder. I think news fatigue is a phenomenon not just in reading about domestic news, but about international news as well.
Well, not only that, but everybody's getting their headlines before we've ever, printed our first story, because of the speed with which news travels and social networks.
And it's changed the way that newspaper organizations, news organizations, probably it's somewhat different with broadcast organizations. You'll see the coverage tends to be these live files that are now updating every 5, 10, 15 minutes, because the experience has shown that that's what the readers are really drawn to. And if you're fortunate, they'll then read some of the other content that you have, but those files are an effort to try to keep up with the headlines that people are all getting on their phones, their news alerts.
Some of the people who are not convinced that international news is important are obviously the people who own or are responsible for the financial health of these news organizations. And that's not new, obviously. It's particularly acute at the Washington Post. But something happened after I worked with both of you guys.
Oh God, maybe he's the thing. Maybe anybody who hires Terry ought to start thinking about their financial health.
I sent a reporter to Israel when none of us could get into Gaza.
Still can't.
And I had a person ask me about, exact words, the ROI on this story, return on investment. You talked about how expensive it is. You know how expensive it is. What is the ongoing argument about why we need to keep doing this despite the costs?
For financial reasons. So this was the argument that was long made at the Washington Post, and which I subscribed to up until a couple months ago. The notion was that even though the audience numbers for international news were significantly lower than those for domestic news, as I'd mentioned previously, if you're trying to attract subscribers to something like the Washington Post or the New York Times, most subscribers want to know that they are getting top-flight international coverage, even if they're not going to be reading all those articles. We always used to hear about the bundle and how international news was a crucial part of that bundle, that people would subscribe knowing it was there for them, even if they were not reading it that much. Obviously, different financial decisions were made in recent months that the cost of international news, which is extremely high, doesn't justify the costs are no longer justified by the subscriber interest or the readership.
And NPR doesn't have that same pressure because NPR is guided by a mission statement that it aims to educate, illuminate, and engage the audience and create community. So for us, it is part of the mission, and we can't not cover the world and say that we are providing the information to keep our audiences informed.
But
also, it's just so intimately tied to everything else.
But you do have the bundle. I mean, every show is a bundle. And the person who talked about the bundle, I was at the Post, was Jeff Bezos. He's like, you got to give people everything, and you can't cut your. I was there when he said this too. You can't cut your way to success. What happened?
Those statements, I think, are still true. From outward appearances, Jeff Bezos changed, or his priorities changed. The Washington Post was not a major investment for him. This was not something he was worried about making a lot of money on or losing a lot of money on. If I could, back when I was on the national desk, I would be the editor who would go to the morning meeting every morning, which every department would present the stories it was planning to do or the reporting questions it wanted to ask. The meeting would start at 9:30. And though we rarely saw Jeff Bezos in the newsroom, on this occasion, he came to the newsroom and he sat on a back bench to listen to the morning meeting. The meeting starts at 9:30, it ends at 10. After the meeting's over, one of the managing editors called me over and he said, you realize it's such a bad day on Wall Street today that in the last half an hour, he lost more money in Wall Street than he spent on the Washington Post. So I mean, perhaps only Jeff Bezos knows why his approach to the Post changed. I do think he was frustrated that he could not solve the riddle of how to make the Washington Post a highly profitable news organization. He was an excellent owner for the first 10 years. He doubled the size of our newsroom. He invested in us. At some point, and I'm just speculating, I think he grew disappointed that he could not solve this riddle. And so he decided to reduce the scope and the ambition of the place. But again, I don't know what's in his mind.
Okay, I was always hoping that he would just believe in the media as one of the pillars of democracy and try to keep the system strong.
And he seemed to do that at the beginning. I mean, he was the one who jumped at the slogan, democracy dies in darkness. I mean, there were all these other ideas that were presented, and he said, no, that's the one that I want. And we were further heartened that we had a correspondent in Iran named Jason Rezaian. Jason was kidnapped and held by the Iranian authorities for more than a year and a half. And when Jason was finally freed by Iran and flown out to Germany, Jeff Bezos flew to meet him on his private plane and welcome him home. And we couldn't have, at that point, we believed we had an owner who believed in our mission, who believed in our staff, that he had won us over and hopefully we had won him over. Something has changed.
Do you think it has to do with politics?
Let's talk about something more fun. This is still, as you said, important work. Talk a little bit about how you've seen the audience change, and even with those changes, why they are so, the work you do is so essential to kind of the communities that you serve.
For NPR, the audience has really changed during the pandemic, and the fact that that our audiences were often commuting when they were listening to us. And when the pandemic hit, the commute stopped, and the numbers dropped pretty sharply with the start of the pandemic. But then they rose again, almost as high as they had been when people realized that NPR was providing information from around the globe about how the pandemic was hitting in, all sorts of different, everywhere around the globe. It was that weird time when everybody on the globe was experiencing something similar, with dealing with the pandemic and the illness and finding treatment and hospitalizations and the like. So our audience came back up, but it's never come back up fully to pre-pandemic levels, or maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe it has come up. Every time there's an election, there's a big spike in numbers because, again, people, as Ellen said, when big news happens, audiences return in a big way.
I was the managing editor at NPR when the pandemic hit, and that thing she described about the numbers going down, it was also heart attack inducing. It was terrifying. And then a weird thing happened. People didn't get back into their cars, but they kept turning on their smart speakers and listening for like 6 hours at a time. And slowly it started coming back.
That's been the other transition. NPR was always radio-based, national public radio. People don't listen through to the radio much anymore. They do listen to our broadcasts, but it's usually through some digital platform or the app or whatever. I still call it the radio, but NPR is trying to do a Kentucky Fried Chicken thing and be NPR instead of National Public Radio, just like Kentucky Fried Chicken is just KFC.
Forgive me if I've... Huh? Forgive me if I called you the wrong name.
It's okay.
I still listen on the radio, but we also listen to the podcasts.
Yeah.
Take yourself out of the Washington Post newsroom mindset for a minute and kind of look at the industry and the challenge ahead. Let's say you had Didik's job. What's top of mind for you, and how do you tackle it?
As we've discussed a bit already, the challenge is finding an audience, attracting an audience. There's been a lot of experimentation, innovation, brainstorming, and a lot of it has not succeeded. I think there are ingredients that remain essential, and they've been the ingredients for successful international coverage for a long time, which is getting to the place, reporting with rigor, reporting with fairness, reporting in a fashion that is revelatory and engrossing. Those are all necessary conditions if there's going to be a future for international reporting, as well as for domestic reporting. I think you're going to have to obviously mobilize for the big stories, which all news organizations have been doing, because that's when the audience is most interested. You need to figure out all the different ways into that big story, give people multiple entry points, meet people where they are in terms of their interests. But also, again, find ways, identify stories, and craft storytelling in a way that resonates with readers. When the story isn't a big breaking story, when it isn't a conflict, you can't rely on incremental news coverage anymore. Most people aren't interested in that. You can't rely on commodity news coverage because they'll find it somewhere else. You have to figure out what are the subject areas that people care about. And this is not about dumbing down the news coverage. In some ways, it's about smartening it up. what are the areas of the world that people care about, that they want to engage with, and then figure out ways to tell those stories, again, to meet the people where they are. Maybe it's writing in a more narrative fashion. Maybe it's telling the story primarily through video. Maybe it's telling it primarily through motion graphics. I don't think there's an easy fix. But again, the two parts of this are to stay true to what is the best of journalism and continue to deliver that, and then find ways to meet people where they are, both in terms of the stories you cover and how you tell them.
Talk about your crew of new correspondents. What's it like to be a first-time foreign correspondent in this moment versus any other time in history? And I know you are a meticulous planner of long-term projects. What's the big idea out there that you think needs to be tackled in this arena in terms of kind of enterprise reporting?
Well, I'll start with the first-time foreign correspondents. I don't hire first-time foreign correspondents. I hire people who have got the experience and at least understand the challenges in being a foreign correspondent. I try to help a lot of people get that experience because there are a lot of reporters at NPR who think they want to be international correspondents.
And everybody calls you up and asks you for jobs. So
it is the best job in the world. So if anybody ever has an opportunity to do it, it is a great experience. But it's not something. It's not something you can easily step into from other reporting jobs. I have had one reporter who stepped into a foreign corresponding job a couple of decades ago. Jason Beaubien came from a member station and jumped into Africa reporting and did a great job. But for the most part, and sadly, fortunately for people who have jobs who can hire, there are sadly a lot of experienced foreign correspondents out there looking for jobs at the moment, in part because of the gutting of the Washington Post, but a lot of other news organizations also have tightened their belts. But I mean, the work covering the globe has evolved just as the methods of getting information have evolved, just as the methods of either airing, publishing, broadcasting, whatever, has all evolved. So for the challenge for the correspondent is that instead of, when I first got to NPR, you were just doing a radio story, and it was a great, sound-rich, character-rich broadcast story, or it was just, the news. In today's world, it's the broadcast story, the text story, the digital, the podcast version, the Instagram version, and then the endless maw of need that newscast represents.
I was going more for a specific topic. Alan did his whole series on, the Sahel, and when I was there, we were thinking about, China and democracy around the globe.
Sadly,
then you got war after war after war.
I've been walloped by war. The world has been walloped by war after war after war. So we've had to cover that. So I haven't really had the luxury of being able to do those sorts of series that I was able to do when you were managing editor. We have done a big focus in the last 2 years, one on the changing world order. That's something that we started out earlier this year, with a lot of both digital, interactive, and broadcast elements that look at how events are affecting the world order and what that means more broadly across many different issues. Before that, we did a big thing on autocracy and the shift toward autocracy in many places around the globe. And before that, it was just a lot of Ukraine, and we did, some great global looks at the impact that conflict had around the world with this great interactive globe that could spin, and you could like pick a place and see how it had been affected. But were I looking at something today, it would probably involve many of those same elements, autocracy still being, I mean, particularly with, with the recent election in Hungary and the shift there, it would have to be looking, again, more deeply at changing world order and leadership and global power, and specifically with Iran, how it's entirely possible that this whole conflict is just pushing Iran even more closely into China's orbit, and China continues to spread its influence around the globe through specific infrastructure projects and Belt and Road.
Yep. You guys have been in positions of doing the biggest, most important journalism. Now, how do you judge your impact, the impact of the work that you've done? And it seems that despite all this great work, the world's still on fire.
I don't think the press is going to ever put the fire out. And in fact, I kind of hope it doesn't, because then we would be even more unemployed.
We didn't start the fire either.
How do you measure impact? That is a question not just for international reporting, it's a question for all journalism. I mean, sometimes you see impact immediately. When I was a 20-year-old intern in my local newspaper, I wrote a story about a redistricting plan in a municipality in New Jersey near where I lived, and after I wrote it, they threw out the plan and came up with a different one. That was immediate impact. And as I've moved up the chain to larger and larger news organizations, often the impact is more diffuse or harder to detect. But sometimes you certainly see it. So the series of stories that we did 2 years ago about, again, how Prime Minister Modi is using technology, which was anchored by a tremendous journalist named Jerry Shih. We were writing about dynamics and developments inside India that the Indian media itself was not writing about, either because they had been co-opted by the government or they'd been intimidated by the government. And those stories that we did then got picked up inside India, in local media, on online platforms, in talk shows, and there were true reverberations across India by what we were writing, what we were able to do. Did it change the practices of the Indian government? Probably not. Did it give the large tech companies something to worry about when they interacted with India? Perhaps. But we saw the impact that series had on people in India itself, doing journalism that the Indian media could no longer do itself. And it was both very heartening to have that kind of impact, but it was also unnerving to think that it had been left to us to do those stories in a country with such a tradition of journalism and such a tradition of journalism. So that was a case where we clearly saw impact.
Alan was a correspondent in Delhi for a while. Impact. And then we'll...
Terry, how do you measure impact? You've been at all these places.
I got you to come here.
Yeah. I don't know how we measure impact. I know how we measure numbers. Do we measure impact through what people take from what they're learning from the news out onto the street or in their writing, or do they does it change the trajectory of their life, and how would we even know? I think it's kind of hard to measure impact. I do think that one way that we measure, I guess, relevance or success is in the number of people who contribute to NPR because they care about what we're doing. Yeah.
Especially if you get the right ones.
Yeah, exactly.
The $100 million ones. See how much fun it was to run a meeting with Didi in it? I think we can go to questions and let you guys join in the conversation.
So both of you talked about trying to reach a younger audience and the challenges that creates for news organizations and kind of what the future is going to look like for journalism. We're at a university where many of the students are here because precisely they are interested in international affairs. What are your thoughts on translating some of that interest in international affairs generally into interest in being a journalist? You know, what's the pipeline from a 16-year-old who is interested in international affairs, may or not be involved in high school journalism, to that first foreign correspondent gig or that first foreign journalism experience, so that is not part of the challenge amongst all of the other challenges? Like, what does that pipeline look like? How have you seen that change for both of you?
And explain that both of you actually did this out of college.
Yeah. Back in the day, I would recommend to anybody students who are interested in journalism or recent college grads or whatever, anybody who was at a point where they were transitioning out of college and wanted to move into the world of journalism, and in particular foreign reporting. Several decades ago, I'd say, go be a freelancer, go find a place in the world where there aren't very many journalists, and start digging around, find interesting stories, find interesting trends, interesting issues, and report on them, and hope that some big news happens and you're the only person there, so that you can actually get known by news organizations, and they then will come back to you when they next need something from Jakarta or wherever you might have landed. In today's world, you can't really do that, in part because of security concerns. We won't take freelance work from folks who take themselves into conflict zones or dangerous stories because they're doing that at such great risk, and I know they're doing it to make a name for themselves, but we can't encourage that kind of work because we're not there supporting them in the way we would be had we sent somebody on our own. So it becomes a lot more difficult. When I went and became a foreign correspondent, I actually went a much more traditional route and I thought that the wire services had had what seemed like a pipeline at the time that you could get overseas within a couple of years. So I got a job with AP, did 2 years in the Southeast, did 2 years in New York, and then got sent overseas, having done a little bit of freelancing when I was younger. But I don't know, Alan, what do you tell people?
Well, it's a question I used to get all the time. Either young journalists or people who wanted to be foreign correspondents would call me up, and I had endless coffees. And I could no longer advise them to do what I had done. I mean, the farm system that used to exist no longer exists. I worked for 1 year at a small paper in New Jersey. I worked for 2 years at a medium-sized paper in Norfolk, Virginia. I then went to the Philadelphia Inquirer for 11 years, which is where I got my first foreign posting, and then I got hired at the Washington Post. That network, that system of newspapers doesn't exist anymore. So the advice I give people is either, if you want to be a foreign correspondent, either go abroad and string from there. There's still a number of organizations that will take the work of stringers, or hook on with a local news organization like the Jakarta Times, for instance, since we mentioned Indonesia, and start to get the clips that way. The most important thing to do is to begin to build that portfolio. The other thing you can do is try to work within American journalism and then get yourself to a newspaper that has foreign correspondents. And the Post still hires, or did hire, people coming from mid-sized newspapers. There's still some out there, or from other organizations like Axios or whatever it might be. Unlike NPR, I would say a third to a half of the foreign correspondents had been people who were at the Post already and were not foreign correspondents. They became first-time foreign correspondents at the Post. They had learned how to cover beats. They had learned how to write. They learned how to be resourceful, to be intrepid. And we've had enormous success. The Post had enormous success with people who made that transition. At the end of the day, the most important thing I would tell any of them is get to a place where you can write. learn to write, learn to report, build your portfolio, and then leverage that to move up.
Did you go to Cairo after college?
Yeah. My father was a journalist, so I did have foreign corresponding in the family. Yeah. So yeah, I did go to Cairo after college, and that's where I did some freelancing.
Did you go to Delhi after college?
I went to Delhi 3 weeks after I graduated. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't go primarily as a journalist.
I went to Roanoke, Virginia.
I went to India primarily as a graduate student to study development economics. But I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and I started freelancing while I was there. And there was no internet. There was, I would place a collect call home to my parents once a month from the Central Post Office. I literally wrote my feature stories on a manual typewriter and mailed them in from the post office. Not a lot of breaking news, but I was able to get clips from the Boston Globe, the Dallas Morning Herald, and a couple other places that way. And it was a start.
The Dallas Morning Herald doesn't exist anymore.
No.
Question.
One of the things that, one of the things that interests me is the financial situation of newspapers around the country is really in bad shape. And I don't know whether that's, cutting back on funding for NPR might be a real possibility in the near future too. I don't know where that's really going, but I'm thinking about, Jeff Bezos cutting back on the Post. The Philadelphia Inquirer almost went out of business a couple of years ago.
It made a profit last quarter.
Well, that's a good sign. But it did have a real problem.
Oh yeah, it was in and out.
And the Boston Globe has faced that problem. And a number you mentioned, and how to sustain this kind of international work when there's such a financial pressure. It must be really great.
It's a tremendous question. There are a couple newspaper or news organizations that are figuring it out. The New York Times seems to have figured it out. They continue to grow. They continue to expand. They've done it in large part by making money off things that are not journalism. So they have attracted an enormous subscriber base through their games. I was playing Spelling Bee in the Uber on the way over here. I play it every morning. Through their recipes and food, through Wirecutter, through The Athletic. They have been able to really do what the Post should have done, which is find alternative sources of subscribers and revenue. And as a result, the New York Times continues to expand. The Guardian is a remarkable success story. The Guardian is owned by a family trust back in the UK. It does not have a paywall here in the US, and the Guardian US now has more daily readers than the Wall Street Journal, and it's continuing to grow and continuing to invest and continue to attract readers, again, because they're not under the immediate financial pressures. But those are the exceptions, and their models are not necessarily something you can replicate at other news organizations. A lot of smart people are trying to figure out, are there foundation models? Are there nonprofit models? Are there cooperative models? There aren't enough benefactors out there. I used to believe that being owned by a billionaire might be the solution. I don't believe that anymore.
One of the things that I have in mind right now is, say that look at the difference between the old Time magazine and the Atlantic. Today, if I understand it correctly, the Atlantic is doing quite well, whereas Time is basically out of business. And Time was reaching out with things like games and recipes and all of that sort of stuff, whereas the Atlantic is much more focused on high-quality analytical material. And you're saying that the problem is the high-quality analytical material is not money-making, whereas games and recipes are. And that seems contrary to what I would think would be the case with regard to Time and the Atlantic.
Yeah, your example is a very good one, and I wouldn't say it's black and white. The Atlantic has been very successful. I do think there is an audience for the kind of work the Atlantic does. And it is trying to position itself potentially as the alternative to the New York Times. But they don't have a lot of the overhead and the cost base that a lot of other media organizations have. And they also have ownership that is willing to invest, to expand, to prevail. And not that many owners are willing to do that anymore. But you're right, The Atlantic is a great success story. When I last talked to the editors over there, their main concern was, are they growing too fast? Do they need to slow down how fast they're growing, or have they gotten out too far over?
Because they're not only doing a quality magazine, but they have a national TV show every Saturday evening with their editor anyway.
I think the common thread between the New York Times model and the Atlantic model is figure out your audience and be completely devoted to serving those needs. So the Times had kind of all of the same problems that the Washington Post had and a lot of other newspapers had, which was this diminishing advertising base and loss of audience. And they figured out who it was that they wanted to reach, and they spent a lot of money figuring out how to do games and recipes, and it pays for a lot of other things that otherwise don't pay for itself. And it's the exact same thing with the Atlantic. They went after it's a smaller audience, but it's easy to monetize. Anyway, one last question. We don't have one. Oh, there we go.
Just on the theme of impact and also the theme of the world is currently on fire, sometimes I see, for example, on the social media, the smaller outlets or even individuals will post things like, well, here's a list of happy news. Do you think that news outlets right now are maybe bogged down, or even do journalists just more actively seek the wars and the human rights violations? Where does that leave us in maybe finding other stories that might be attractive to more audiences who are looking for happy stories? I don't know.
So NPR, at least, we've got things like Life Kit that is a podcast devoted to kind of life hacks, basically. We've got another podcast called Shortwave, which is this great little podcast where you get, I think it's 3 times a week, very cool new science, developments within science. We've got our magazine shows cover the gamut. It's books, it's movies, it's music. Speaking of which, we've got Tiny Desk. Yesterday, we had Foo Fighters. They play right above my head. My office is literally right below the Tiny Desk. NPR is trying to provide, not trying to, NPR provides a lot of different things for different people and tries to, is always looking for new ideas and new corners that it hasn't explored. International is just part of it. And within international, we also try to do music and culture and trends and just interesting innovations and whatever. We do tend to get a little consumed by conflict because you can't ignore it when blood's being shed and people are dying, and you can't ignore, earthquakes and catastrophes, but we do try.
It's not a new idea. It's the essence of the bundle. If you live in a town, maybe you have a sports section that brings you happy news.
What an idea.
Thank you so much for being here. This was fun. And obviously, this conversation is not at an end, and we will continue as we go. Thank you so much.